we were at Milton Hall. Headquarters was at Milton Hall. It was at Milton Hall that we were alerted. We were given all our equipment. We made the trip from Milton Hall to London, which was about 80 miles, in a covered truck. This time, we thought that it was a dry run. We thought it was just a scheme. Once that we got to London, once that we got into this safe house, or briefing house, we found out that it was the real McCoy. As soon as we started being briefed, we found out that our job was to work with SAS. Well, in the past, we hadn't received any training to work with SAS or with OGs or with parachute troops. We were trained to work as a team of three. A French officer, a radio operator, either an American or a British officer. We resented working with SAS because they were doing a little different type of work than we were. They were doing a type of work that would, we thought, give our position away, and we were trying to work underground while they were working in the open. After quite a discussion, and after they called up a couple of English colonels and one English general, they asked us if we would please take this job because it was a very important job. So we saw General Koenig, who was our commanding officer, who was the commanding officer of the French Forces of the Interior, and he told us that he wanted us to take it, so we took it. Well, from there, after being briefed, we went to the SAS camp. The SAS camp, we met Commandant Bourgoin, who was to be our commanding officer, or that is, he was the commanding officer of the 4th Battalion of SAS. The 4th Battalion of SAS was composed of purely Frenchmen. And most of the Frenchmen were from Brittany. And our mission was to go into Brittany to establish two bases, one in the northern part of Brittany and one in the southern part. And we were to organize what resistance we could, arm them, and attempt to cut Brittany off from the rest of France. As I said before, most of these French parachutists were from Brittany, and they were going back into their home country. As soon as we got to the SAS camp, the commanding officer asked to see me. I was the only American there. He asked me if I was American, and I said yes. Told me he didn't have a hell of a lot of use for Americans. And I could act accordingly. Said that he'd had some trouble with the Americans. Americans had let him down in North Africa. It didn't start us off too good, but we took it. Well, we left that night. One thing, we had a little argument with him. We wanted to put our packs in baskets because we had been trained to jump with our packs in baskets while SAS were jumping with their packs on leg bags. And we'd never jumped with a pack on a leg bag. But he said, no, you'll get out of the plane somehow, so we just said okay and went up to the airport that night. And they brought us into a room where there were a lot of chutes and said, okay, put on your chute. It was the first time we'd put on our chute because before the dispatcher would always help us on with our chute. So we managed to get into a chute and went out to the plane. 24 men got into the plane, into every plane that big, 24 men. Made it pretty crowded. They were laying one on top of the other and everything else. Well, our trip was quite uneventful. As we went over the coast, we picked up quite a lot of flak. But we got out of that all right. And everyone seemed to more or less go to sleep on the way out. Pretty soon we came to the field, circled the field once. The lights were down there. And the first 12 men stood up and ran down towards the end of the tail end of the plane. And as soon as they came to the hole, they just fell through. It was not a way that we had been accustomed to jumping. We'd been accustomed to jumping in three and sitting right around the edge of the hole. And when the word go, action station number 1, go, well, we just go, and it was very simple. Well, this was something different. Well, when we started down, I think I was jumping number 13, we picked up this sack in our hands, weighed about 80 pounds, and started down towards the tail end of the plane. And one of the men ahead of us, his static line fouled in the rear of the plane. The static line was flying around in the plane, so we stopped the guy and finally got this straightened up and made another circle over the field and just ran down towards the tail end of the plane with a bag in our hand and just dropped through the hole. Well, it seemed pretty good to get out of the plane because there was quite a lot of tension in the plane. When the chute opened, having this sack in our hand, it nearly jerked our arms out of the sockets. But we held on to it all right. We got about 100 feet from the ground, saw about, looked as though about 10 or 15 men were running to the spot I was going to land. And it was a very uncomfortable feeling because I didn't know if they were Germans or Frenchmen. And I had this sack in my hand, I couldn't get my pistol out. And in the next moment I hit the ground, and when I hit the ground I sort of rolled up in my parachute. And all these bodies around there were jumping on top of me, trying to get me out of the parachute, and I didn't know what their intentions were. I couldn't get out my pistol. Finally I found out that I heard them speaking French, so I knew they were Frenchmen. And finally got untangled and told them I was American, and they started yelling and whooping and one thing and another. And I asked them to sort of keep quiet because in our training we'd been taught to not to make too much noise at a reception committee. Well, they told us there wasn't anything to worry about. The Germans were far away, and I asked them how far, and they said 2 kilometers. I didn't think it was very far, but they seemed to think that was all right. So then we were brought up into the center of a field where there were about 50 or 60 men standing right in the center of a field. First thing I said to them, I said, don't you think that we should move off to the woods or not stand right here in the field? And they said, oh, well, don't worry about it. There's plenty of protection around here. And some joker yelled out over in the woods, and hey, Joe, you over there? And somebody hollered back. So everybody was yelling, and every once in a while somebody was shooting off a shotgun. So there was a hell of a lot of noise around. From there, after all the parachutists were grouped together, we were taken down to a farmhouse. Well, actually, there were about 300 people at this reception committee, men, women, and children. And as soon as they found out an American was there, everybody rushed over and, well, they were kissing everybody. They were kissing them and lugging us around on their shoulders. It was a regular circus. Girls were lined up five deep to kiss everybody, and they had wine, champagne, cognac, one thing and another. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they had big bouquets of flowers, and it was terrific. Terrific. Well, we made contact with one of the leaders there. Everyone seemed to be the leader, but we finally got out the real leader and had him pick up all the containers, because each plane that came in had brought containers with them. So we brought all the containers down to the farm and started opening up the containers. Well, the minute they saw these arms, everybody was willing to march against this German garrison at 3 o'clock in the morning. About 5 o'clock in the morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, we went to bed. We went up in this hay barn, up in the hayloft. Quite a few men, people sleeping up there in the hayloft. So we went up there, the radio operator and this French captain, myself, we undressed and got into a sleeping bag. As I get into the sleeping bag, I just get into my sleeping bag, and a girl who was sleeping over here on my right said, you're an American, aren't you? Sort of. Come to find out, the hay barn was half full of girls. Everybody was, a man was sleeping here and a girl sleeping there. No one thought anything of it. To make a long story short, we were at this farmhouse from the 7th of June till the 18th. Many things happened in the meantime, too numerous to go into detail about every one. The first thing the SAS did upon landing was send SAS men out to blow bridges that very night. We brought a lot of explosives in with us, and we immediately attacked all communications. We cut rails, railroad bridges, telephone lines. There were no railroads running, no telephone lines. All communications were cut in our section of Brittany. One mistake that they did was arm some of the FFI immediately and let them go out and attack the Germans that they found in cafes, on the road, wherever they happened to find them. The very next day, FFI started coming back with German trucks, German motorcycles, all sorts of German equipment. What they were doing, they'd just take a gun and walk into a restaurant, and there were 7 or 8 Germans sitting around there, just walk in and spray them, and if they had a truck outside, take the truck. Truck might be filled with flour, they'd bring it back. If it was filled with any kind of German equipment, they'd bring it back to this farmhouse. Result, we had all kinds of trucks and motorcycles, and all sorts of German equipment around the camp. But it was also bringing attention to this base that we were trying to build up. The next morning when we got up, we started looking for our radios. Our radios were dropped in baskets. We couldn't locate them. About 9 o'clock in the morning, plane came over, broad daylight, dropped out 2 packages, and our radio. Seems that the dispatcher forgot to throw them out that night, and went back to their base, discovered our radios were there, came back in the broad daylight and threw them out. That didn't help matters any, since the German garrison was 2 miles away. But by noon, most of the containers had been broken open, and we'd armed what FFIs that were around the house, so we did have some local security. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the answer to our call to arms by the French patriots was stupendous. It was far greater than anyone had dreamed. Between the 7th of June and the 18th of June, we had actually armed and trained 5,000 men. 5,000 men, a lot of men, to hold around one farmhouse. What we were doing was arming a battalion of about 500 men and then sending them out, sending them back to where they came from. One would be the butcher, the other would be a farmer or whatever he happened to be. We'd send him back to his farm or to his butcher shop or bakery or whatever it is, with instructions to hide his arms and to take no offensive action against the Germans until he received further orders. From the first day that we were in there till the 18th of June, we were in contact with the enemy. That is, they kept sending out little patrols to the area around this farmhouse, and we would kill a few of them, and perhaps they would kill a few of us, but there was no big attack. And the reason that there was no big attack, I believe, was that the Germans didn't realize the force that we had there. They thought that they had a few patriots that were arming up, and as long as a lot of patriots were forming and didn't have the weapons or anything, they were not too dangerous. And at that moment, it was just after D-Day, and just after D-Day, the Germans were so jumpy that they didn't dare to pull any force, such as a regiment or a division, out of line to come back and attack us. They couldn't afford it, although there were 13 German divisions in Brittany at this time. Many things happened in these last few days. We received agents from Paris, agents from London. In the meantime, we had contacted all resistance in Brittany, all resistant leaders. If the leaders and the groups of men were too far from our base for us to arm them, we sent a message to London asking them to send a JED team to that area. And we made the necessary arrangements with that resistance leader to receive this JED team. That way we could arm all of Brittany, even though it was quite a ways from our base. Well, everything went pretty well until the morning of the 18th, which was Sunday morning. That night we had received 30 planes, and in these 30 planes we received 5 jeeps. These 5 jeeps were armed with twin submachine guns, twin machine guns, Browning machine guns, Vickers. About 6 o'clock that morning, 2 cars containing 4 felt gendarmes, which is something like our military police, came down the road towards our farm. They were stopping every once in a while, getting out, looking around, getting back into the car and coming down. They came down to our outpost. When they got to our first outpost, they stopped. An SAS man who was in the ditch there got out of the ditch and stepped into the road with his pistol and was going to take them prisoners. One made a move to get a hand grenade, so he pulled the trigger and discovered that his pistol wasn't loaded. So before he could reload his pistol, a German threw a hand grenade at him, landed a little ways from him, but didn't kill him. In the meantime, FFI had stepped out of a ditch and shot 3 or 4 of the Germans. Well, that would have been all right, but there was another outpost about 300 yards away that had a machine gun in it. And when this other outpost noticed these 2 cars up there with the Germans standing around, they opened fire on these 2 cars. And the fire was going pretty wild. They killed a few of the Germans, but they also wounded the SAS and the FFI, who were right there in this road with the Germans. And result, one of the Germans got away. They killed 4, wounded 1, took 1 prisoner, and 1 got away. Well, this was only a little incident because it had been happening all the time we were there. But about 10 o'clock in the morning, 250 felt gendarmes came back. They came into a little town by the name of Saint-Marcel and took about 40 Frenchmen and marched the Frenchmen ahead of them down towards our farm. Well, we couldn't shoot at them without hitting the Frenchmen, so we just backed up and let them come in until we sucked them into an open field. As soon as we sucked them into this open field, we swung up around their flank with the jeeps and pretty well cut them up. They immediately started yelling rouse and went back and took a defensive position around this little town. Well, they never expected to meet the firepower that they met, because they expected that they would meet a few partisans armed with shotguns and 22s. Well, quite a little battle took place. There was the woods on our right and left and wheat fields up on our left, and they shot traces into these woods and into the wheat fields and started a forest fire. Result, there was so much smoke that our vision was limited, and we were fighting very close. That is, when you did see a German, he was generally at 15 and 20 yards away, and he either got you or you got him. And this went on for about an hour. Then they seemed to pull out. They left a few there. Just it was purely they did a little defensive fighting, but that was all. Well, what had happened in the meantime was that when they saw our jeeps, they thought that we were an airborne division, and we later found out that they had notified Rommel that we were an airborne division. So he sent in some parachute troops on us. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, parachute troops came. They were very bold, very aggressive fighters. They fought like hell. They didn't take advantage of cover or anything, but they were so aggressive that they soon overran some of our positions, but at a great cost to their life. If 10 parachutists got killed coming down one lane, well, 20 would run in where 10 got killed, and if 20 got killed, well, 40 would come in. They just kept coming from everywhere. An example, if you took one shot at them and 10 of them were in a wheat field, 10 of them would stand right up and just start looking for the man who took a shot, and you could pick off 2 or 3 of them. Well, things were not going so good. They had encircled our position. In the meantime, we had called out all these battalions that had been laying low, and everyone, instead of fighting on the outside of the circle, everyone came into the center of the circle, so that we were holding a radius of about 10 miles with approximately 4,000 men in there. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they had us completely surrounded and were pushing us back towards the farmhouse. So we went back to the headquarters, back to the farmhouse, and sent an SOS to London for planes. Within 2 hours and a half, we had about 35 fighter bombers over us. They did a pretty good job of bombing transportation, German transportation that was coming up. But as far as bombing the troops, it was pretty difficult to see what was going on the ground. And they bombed hell out of us. Yeah, but it helped our morale, helped the morale of the patriots, because they knew that they hadn't forgot us in London. Now, everyone that was inside of this circle, after we were once surrounded, I'm sure that he didn't think he was going to get out of there alive. And he was fighting till death. Therefore, if the parachutists did move in, they moved in over FFI dead bodies, because they never budged an inch. Well, by 8 o'clock at night, they had driven into about 800 yards from the farmhouse, and they were on a hill dominating the farmhouse. It's pretty hard to describe the scene at the farmhouse about this time, because practically every SAS officer was either killed or wounded, and we only had a very, very small first aid station. The first aid station couldn't take care of 1/10 of the wounded. Everyone was laying around the yard, around this barnyard, either dying, dead, or bleeding, and some of them were screaming, some of them were not saying anything. It was just terrific. The confusion was absolutely terrible. There was only one thing to do when they had us at that farmhouse, when they were so close, was to launch a counterattack. So we got the two remaining jeeps. We had 2 jeeps left, farmhouse. And I remember a French officer I can't think of his name offhand, but one of the best officers I've ever seen in my life. He'd been shot through the shoulder and shot in the head. He tied himself into a jeep so he wouldn't fall out. With another SAS that drove the jeep, he started off in the counterattack. Captain Irad, who is my French partner, took one group of men numbering about 400 or 500, and I took a group of men numbering about 400 or 500 and launched this counterattack. Well, we drove them back about 1,000 yards. We drove them down on the other side of the hill. It was a bloody massacre. We must have lost about 600 or 700 men in about an hour. And we drove them back a little too far because the Germans that were on our right drove in on our right flank behind us, so as a result, we had to fight our way back. When I got back to the farmhouse, it was pretty hard to control the men because there was so much confusion and so many hedges. You couldn't see exactly where your men were in the next field. When I got back to the farmhouse, I tried to locate Captain Irad, and I couldn't find him anywhere. And it was getting dusk. It was about 9:30, 10 o'clock. And the Germans had taken a little barn, a little shed, about 300 yards away from the farmhouse where the SAS radio equipment was. So the SAS wanted to go down and get their radio equipment. So I went down there with a group of FFI and an SAS lieutenant that hadn't been killed. The SAS lieutenant and myself were the only ones to come back alive. Most of them got killed when we walked up to the edge of a hedge that was overlooking a wheat field, and we were trying to distinguish Germans from FFI on the other side of this field. And we'd been there for about 5 minutes when a machine gun opened up about 10 yards in front of us. This German machine gun had been there all the time and hadn't fired, and all the FFI were in one group, and most of them got it in that one group, and we were not able to take this shed where their radio equipment was. We went back for help and brought some more FFI down and kept quite a large no man's land there between one field and another. They were on the other side of the field, we were on this side of the field, and there was no cover that they could advance, so we just held them there. Commandant Baudouin, who was this French officer commanding SAS, was in a pretty tight situation. He had not been wounded. He decided that the only thing to do would be break through after dark. So we issued orders that as soon as darkness fell, we were to split up in small groups and try to break through the encirclement as best we could. It was more or less every man for himself. And those that did get through were to stay in small groups, no larger than 2 or 3, and were to take no offensive action against the Germans until further orders. Well, oh yes, we also made a rendezvous for the next day. All the leaders were supposed to meet at a certain spot the next day. And out of those, there were 5 or 6 leaders that knew where this rendezvous was. And they were to bring no more than 3 or 4 of their immediate subordinates, so that everyone wouldn't know where this rendezvous was. Therefore, we wouldn't have a whole flock of FFI coming to one spot and attracting a lot of attention. Well, I finally located Captain Irad in a radio operator. And we were supposed to leave in a car, so we went out back to get into the car. I can't emphasize enough the situation at this point. Everybody was, we had hundreds and hundreds of wounded, and everyone was around the farmhouse. Everyone was asking to be carried out, and if a man was shot through a leg or through the guts or anything, you just couldn't do anything for him. You just left him there, and if he looked at you, you just looked away and just didn't say anything. Some of them never said a word. I have to come back. I forgot something. We had armed 5,000 men, but we had also received a store of arms for another 5,000 that hadn't been distributed. And we also had about 5 tons of high explosives. And that was the reason why we were holding the farmhouse, because it would have been foolish to fight this type of warfare with untrained men against a trained enemy had we had not some objective in view. Well, when we saw it was impossible to hold, we decided to blow up the arms of 5,000 men with the high explosive we had. So that was one of the things we were going to do as soon as we left. One of the things that I remember quite clearly was when we decided to blow up the arms, there were quite a few SAS men laying around wounded. And they didn't want to blow it up by a time pencil. That is, they didn't want to put a time fuse on it and let it blow up when the time fuse expired. They didn't want to do that because they figured if the Germans got up there and cut the fuse, the explosives wouldn't go off and they'd have the arms. So about 5 or 6 of the wounded men laying around the floors and on the tables and one thing and another were arguing with one another to see who would blow it up. Naturally, it was certain death, but they didn't do it with any... so they were trying to be brave or anything. They just sensibly argued to see who would blow it up. I remember one man saying, "Well, now don't be foolish. Why should you blow it up? You're only shot through both legs, and I'm shot in the chest and the arms, and just carry me up there, and I'll blow it up myself." Well, anyway, we went out to get in this car that was going to take us out. And when we got to the car, there were about 50 people trying to get into the car, and they were going to shoot it out to see who got in the car because everyone was looking out for his own hide then. And it was a survival of the fittest. So we decided to let them go rather than get into any trouble. So we took off by ourselves. We plotted our azimuth to this rendezvous that we were supposed to go to and started out. As we started out, 5 British pilots who we had previously picked up that had been shot down wanted to go with us because they were lost. No one was paying any attention to them, so we told them they could come with us. So we started out. We joined a company that was going to make a breakthrough as one body, as a company. We broke through all right. They lost quite a few men. No one in our party was killed. As soon as we got on the outside of what we considered the outside of the ring, we left them and went on by ourselves. It was dark by this time, about 11 o'clock. It didn't get dark until about 11 o'clock because it was in the middle of the summer. We had a lot of trouble with the British pilots. They were good boys, but they had these British hobnail shoes on. They were making an awful lot of racket at night, and they knew nothing about infantry tactics, and they were absolutely terrible. We walked for about 2 hours and sat down beside a little field for a little rest. We didn't know it, but we'd sat down right beside a road. And about 5 minutes after we sat down there, a German column of paratroopers started marching up this road, and we were about 20 yards away from this road. It took them about 15 minutes to walk by. Sort of a ticklish situation. If I can give you an idea of what was going on, it wasn't just this easy. You see, everyone had been trying to break through, and everyone had broken through in small groups, broken through this encirclement. Therefore, we had small groups wandering around everywhere and trying to get away. And one small group would run into another. That is, if an FFI group ran into another FFI group, well, they would just stop firing at one another, not knowing that they were FFI, because there were German patrols trying to pick up the FFI groups that had broken through. And result, everyone was firing at everything that moved. They were killing horses and cattle and everything else. 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a terrific explosion. We were approximately 10 miles away. Nearly knocked us to the ground. It was terrific. Turned night into day. I think I can't quite describe the explosion, but it was terrific. Our ammunition started going off and went off all night, way into the next day. This explosion certainly confused the Germans. By this time, they had brought up a little artillery, and they started firing artillery out into the dark anywhere it might land. They couldn't understand. It's my idea that they couldn't understand what this explosion was. Well, we kept on until about 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 o'clock in the morning, we decided to lay down and get a little rest. There were just a very few hedges around, no cover, so we decided to lay low in a wheat field. We went into a wheat field from different angles so that we wouldn't leave any one path giving our position away. We had laid in this wheat field, we laid in a semicircle. I think we laid there until about 6 o'clock in the morning when we were awakened by Cossacks, Russian Cossacks, coming by on horseback. It was a pretty good thing that they woke us up, I guess, because we looked around and discovered that we were within sight of a German radio station. So it didn't take us very long to get out of there. We got out of there and continued our journey towards our rendezvous. We arrived at our rendezvous. We arrived at a rendezvous, I think, about 10 o'clock in the morning. Everyone was there. One thing I've got to say at this point, there was an organization named the BOA, sent in by London, and this organization was to find, their main job was to find landing grounds and make reception committees. And this one man, whose name was Tainsbury, had on paper all the landing grounds that we were to use in Brittany. And later he was captured by the Gestapo. Therefore, every time we attempted to use one of these grounds, we always had a reception committee of either Feldgendarme or Gestapo. Well, after holding a council of war that day, we decided to break up. That is, Commandant Bourgoin, with his SAS, were to go underground. He was to get into civilian clothes and lay low and let the heat cool off, because this was just the next day and everything was boiling around there. White Russians, they were Georgian Russians, would come into a house, and if there were 3 men in that house, other than one, where there was one before, they just killed everybody, men, women, and children. They were rotten. They were terrible. They were even worse than the Germans. They committed all sorts of atrocities. And that day that we were there, they were riding down through towns, shooting men, women, and children. They just ride down through a town on horseback and just fire into the houses and one thing and another. Well, it was impossible to keep the patriots from firing back. We had told them to lay low and not take any offensive action against the Germans, but their action was more or less defensive, because if a German came into the house to kill his wife, well, naturally the man would fight. And so everyone was fighting for a radius of about 40 or 50 miles around there. Something else I've got to tell you now that I forgot. Previously, we were attacked on Sunday. Saturday, we had made plans to go to the WWII, which was the next department. That is, Jedburgs George had our team, myself, Captain Erad, and our radio operator. We're going to go to the WWII to try and organize the resistance in the WWII and arm them. We had armed 5,000 men and had another 5,000 organized, ready to arm, so we considered our work done in this department of the Morbihan. We also had 2 Gestapo agents working for us. We were paying them a high price, and we also promised them that when the Americans got to us, that we'd see that they got a fair deal, that they would be turned over to us and work with us. So that we had previously gone to the department of the WWII with these 2 Gestapo agents in their car. We'd sit in the back seat and they'd sit in the front, and every time that we were stopped by a German patrol, they would just show their identification and everything was all right. But Sunday we had been attacked, so Monday we couldn't very well go with them. Everything was shot up in the air. So we decided to go to the WWII and leave Bourgoin in the Morbihan. We were to keep contact with Commandant Bourgoin through London. That is, we were to send a message to London, and London would relay our message back to Bourgoin, since we didn't have communications direct to him. Well, he left, and that left us, Jed George, with 2 agents known as Otard and Fonction. We hadn't slept, we hadn't eaten for 3 or 4 days, about 3 days I think it was, so we decided to eat supper there at the Chateau de Cadillac. We were at a big chateau. There was a count and a countess at the chateau, the Count de Landman and the Countess de Landman. We sat down for supper that night, and a parachutist came in and said, you'd have to leave immediately if there was a possibility of leaving, because we were surrounded. The Germans knew we were there and were coming in to take us. This old lady, who was about 45 years old, said that she would get us out of there. So she took us down through this garden and through a hole in the wall. It was a very big wall surrounding the castle, and the Germans hadn't got inside of this wall. It was very dark, and it was raining very hard. It had been raining all day. She took us by the hand down through the woods to a river. It was so dark that she actually had to lead us by the hand. When we got to the river, she told us to swim the river and to travel north, follow the river north. And she also told us that sometime during the night that she would whistle. She gave the prearranged whistle, and that she would take us to a safe hiding place. So we swam across the river and decided that she was a very nice old lady, but a little nuts, because no one was going to find us in the middle of the night, raining and everything like that. So we started north, and she returned to the chateau to clear up any evidence that we'd left around there, such as English cigarette butts or coffee cans or anything that might cause them to get in trouble with the Germans. Well, as strange as it may seem, 4 o'clock in the morning, we heard the old lady whistling on the other side of the river. We answered her whistle. She jumped into that river and swam across. We nearly got drowned swimming across the river. The river was swollen. She got across just like nobody's business, and then took us to a mill, an old mill, where we slept for about an hour and a half. This time we were living on benzene tablets, tablets that will give you a lot of false strength as long as you live on them, as long as you keep taking them every 6 hours. But the minute that you relax and you don't take them, well, then you just can't go any further. So we took some more of these tablets and struck off the next morning for a farmhouse, which was supposed to be a safe house. Well, we got out to this safe house after having a couple of narrow scrapes with these Russian Cossacks. Because these Russian Cossacks were really raising hell. They were doing everything. They were committing all sorts of atrocities. They took one 5-year-old boy. They came into this house, and parents weren't at home, but there was a 5-year-old boy at home, so they took him and nailed him to a door when he was alive and then bayoneted him through the belly. It took quite a while for him to die. They were doing such things as that. They caught one of our girls. We were using a lot of girls as liaison agents. They could get through where a man couldn't get through. And they caught this girl. Her name was Mary. She was a very nice-looking girl, dark hair, and she'd come from Paris. She'd bicycled in from Paris. I think it was something like 300 or 400 kilometers. And she bicycled from Paris to our headquarters to bring us a message. And they caught her and tied a rope underneath her armpits, then tied the rope around the saddle horn of the saddle and dragged it down the road until she was dead. Well, they were doing things like that. Anyway, we got out to this farmhouse and laid low there. We picked up quite a few parachutists and other wounded that had got through, and we were keeping them in this house. Well, we had no first aid facilities or anything like that, so gangrene was setting in, and broken bones. Men had attempted to walk with broken legs, and the bones were overlapping. So we finally made contact with a doctor who was willing to come out and take care of them. Well, we nearly got caught in this farmhouse by felt gendarmes, so we decided to move out away from the farmhouse. So we found, with the help of the farmer, we found an old oven that a charcoal maker used to use. It was a hole in the ground. It was very, very dark in this hole in the ground. You couldn't see a thing. And we literally lived in the ground for 5 days. 5 days and 5 nights. It was pretty rugged. It doesn't seem like much, but 24 hours a day is a long time to just sit in the dark and not say much, because you can talk for the first 24 hours, but then you can't think of anything to talk about, and you start getting grouchy at one another. Jean-Pierre, who was our liaison agent, had been sent ahead, and he had made arrangements for us to stay at the Chateau de la Gare. We then went into this Chateau de la Gare and slept in the library. The Count sneaked us in, and it was the first time we'd been in a bed for about a month. Once we got in there, we felt pretty good and started talking out loud, and he told us it would be a good idea for us to be quiet because he had some Luftwaffe officers sleeping in the other end of the chateau. So it was a kind of an uncomfortable feeling to begin with, but we got used to it. In between us and the Luftwaffe officers were a lot of orphans. The Americans had accidentally bombed an orphanage, and they had evacuated the children that were not casualties, and they were staying there in this chateau. Up until now, we had been living in military clothes, but at this point, the Count got us some civilian clothes, and we started going in civilian clothes. Well, we finally contacted this underground leader in Anceny, and this is what we had decided to do. We were going to act as démaires of the WWII. Démaire means military chiefs of that department, while Fonction was going to be démaire of Ille-et-Vilaine, which was a department to the north, and Auteuil, who was the other agent, was going to be a démaire of the Morbihan, so that we can control the 3 departments. They gave us the Loire-Inférieure because I think they were afraid to take it themselves. It was a very tough department, and no one had been in there to organize it, while Ille-et-Vilaine and Morbihan had been organized. It was a very, very difficult job to organize the Loire-Inférieure, and all the credit goes to the French officer that was with me. He did a splendid job. All the underground in the WWII was more or less run by the Gestapo. That is, the Gestapo agents were actually chiefs of the underground. A Gestapo agent in civilian clothes who speaks fluent French is just like any Frenchman. And at that time, Frenchmen were coming in from everywhere, and no one was asking questions because everyone was escaping this forced labor in Germany. So a man could come in, and if he was intelligent and smart, he could sell somebody the idea that he was hated the Germans and one thing and another, and could easily work himself up to get a group to work for him, and he would be an underground man working against the Germans in the resistance. And another thing we ran up against was several different groups, several different organizations, underground organizations were active in the Loire Inférieure. And while they were not busy fighting the Germans, they were busy fighting amongst themselves. That is, if Joe here had 100 men under him and Jack had 150, well, Jack would be fighting Joe to get his men away, and one might be a communist while the other was just an FFI, and everyone was fighting everyone else. So it was quite a job to take and weld these different groups into one. The actual men that were enlisted into these groups were very good men. It was the leaders that were causing all the trouble. So it was necessary to take care of the leaders. A few of the leaders came up missing, and to make a long story short, everything was welded into one. And Captain Arad, by some miracle, did it without getting caught, because we'd have meetings of 12 leaders one day, and the next day there'd be 3 left, because there was a Gestapo agent at the meeting, and he had all these men that were at the meeting picked up. We were not living in one place any length of time. We'd stay in one house maybe one day, and then we'd move into a hotel the next day, and one day we'd be living as students, and perhaps the next day as old farmers in old dirty overalls with wooden shoes, and then the next day we'd be living in a doctor's house or something like that, so that we never stayed in one place, and we never let anyone know where we were staying. The 3 of us stayed together all the time. And when we had made contact with anyone, it was through a liaison agent at a certain rendezvous. The liaison agent didn't know where we were staying. We didn't want him to know, and he didn't want to know. In the event that he would get caught, he wouldn't be able to tell where we were. Well, to make a long story short, we organized Loire Inférieure. We had about 5,000 men organized. Well, up until this time, we hadn't made contact with London. That is, we hadn't made contact with London since we had been shot up at Safri. And this organization took about 3 weeks, and since we hadn't come on the air for 3 weeks, some joker in London thought that we were controlled by the Gestapo. He thought the Gestapo had caught us, and they were forcing us to send messages just the same. I don't know why he ever thought that, because in the event that we're captured by the Gestapo, we have a certain number that we change in our code that signifies that we're being forced to work, and all information that's coming through is false. Well, we hadn't changed that, and our cipher chief in London kept insisting with the BCRA, which was the French organization that was handling us, and he kept insisting that we were not controlled by the Gestapo, but nevertheless, they didn't work with us. Well, we used to send 4 messages a day, and some at night, begging them, pleading with them to send us any kind of equipment, because at that time, Patton's army, the Third Army, was coming down into Brittany, and the Germans were escaping up the Loire, and we had no arms or anything to stop them with. Well, we had reception committees out on different grounds, night and day, for about 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, well, they just had lost faith in us. It was all right for the first few days, but then we started losing a lot of men on these grounds. You take a group of Frenchmen and put them out on the ground for a reception committee, and it'll be all right for the first 2 days, but they talk a little too much, and the first thing you know, everyone knows about it, and the first thing you know, some Gestapo man knows about it, and they're all picked up, shot, or something else. So when London just wouldn't play with us, we lost all hope in it. One thing that London was interested in, and the only thing London was interested in, we had a man who was working for us, a Frenchman, who was an engineer working for the Todd organization. And he was working in a G2, in a German G2 office. And he was reproducing plans. And every plan that came into this G2 office, he would make a duplicate copy and give us a duplicate copy, so that we had a copy of all the coastal defenses along the Loire and Ferrières, and a copy of the plans of U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire. And we notified London that we had these plans, and they became interested in them, and we're going to send a Lysander in after them. So we said, well, that's good. If the Lysander comes in, well, if we have to throw the pilot out, we'll go back to London ourselves and straighten this out, because they sent us here to do a job, and once we get the thing ready, they won't send us any arms. Well, they didn't send the Lysander in. They couldn't send it in, and when they couldn't send it in, we couldn't get the plans, and nothing worked out. Well, it came to the point where we had to take the situation into our own hands and not wait for London, because the Germans by this time were really leaving the Brittany Peninsula. So we gave the orders to all these men to strike the enemy in any possible by any possible means they could. We got a lot of saws and axes and chopped trees across the roads and did everything we could to hinder their escape up the Loire. We blew up bridges with gun cottons, and for fuses we used to use cigarette lighters and things like that. It was just, it wasn't very good. And we armed a few men by actually taking the weapons away from the Germans. Say that 2 Germans were at a bar or in some pub. Well, 10 Frenchmen would go in and knock them over the head with a bottle and take 2 guns, and with 2 guns they'd shoot 4 Germans and get 4 guns, and with 6 guns they'd get 10, and that way they armed themselves, but it was very inadequate. About this time, Patton was driving down into the Brittany Peninsula, and we decided these plans were quite important, so we were going to, and since London couldn't send in a Lysander, we were going to try to get the plans through to the Third Army. We're going to try to infiltrate through, if we could. Well, Saturday we were eating dinner, and this woman came up, this liaison agent, and said that the Americans had made a terrific advance and were at Chateaubriand, which was about 100 kilometers away. So we decided to try to get the plans through if we could. Colonel Vaudel, who was the colonel of the Loire and Ferrières, all the underground in the Loire and Ferrières had centralized under one command, and Colonel Vaudel, or Colonel Felix, was the commanding officer. So he and myself, in civilian clothes on bicycles, were to go down the road along the River Loire to contact any Americans that might be coming up the river, while the French officer, Captain Erard, and the radio operator were to come down a back road with the plans in civilian clothes. So everything went all right. We came into a little town of Varad, that is the colonel and I, and from there we held a little council of war, and we swapped addresses, that is the pilots and myself, and talked it over and said if anyone does get through this alive, well, they could tell the story. I also told the pilots at this point that they should go out by themselves. That is, they should break into groups of 2 and 3 and try to get through for themselves, and not to stick with us, because the Gestapo knew who we were, had pictures, had all the information they wanted on us, and if they were caught with us, well, they'd get the same works that we were going to get. While if they were caught by themselves and told a true story, they might get away as prisoners of war, since they were pilots shot down. Well, 2 of the Americans and 1 of the British were willing to do that, and they took off immediately. And they were gone for about 50 yards, and the 3 of them were killed. They ran right into a machine gun. So that scared the other 2, and the other 2 wanted to stick with us. So they stayed with us, and we struck off in another direction. Well, we ran into another machine gun, and everybody immediately changed directions. And I remember my glasses caught on a twig and were pulled off, so I went back to get them. And by this time, everyone was out of breath, and no one, I wasn't carrying so much. Figured, well, if I get killed here, I won't get killed some other place. And the guy was shooting over my head all the time. So I threw a grenade at him, and he stopped firing and picked up my glasses and looked around, and by this time, everybody had left me. They'd all got ahead of me. So I ran to catch up with them, and I soon found that my French captain was waiting for me. So he said, well, we're getting nowhere fast, just we've been running in circles here, and we just can't break through this thing, so we might as well lay low. So the radio operator came back, and 1 agent, and this British and American pilot. And at this point, I told these 2 pilots to leave us immediately, and they didn't say anything, so I pulled a gun on them and told them either leave or I'd shoot them. And the American pilot fell on the ground and just couldn't go. He was scared like a rabbit, just like a dog when you beat a dog. He puts his tail between his legs and get down. He just couldn't move, so there wasn't anything we could do. Is just leave him with us, and if he was caught, well, he'd have to suffer the consequences. So we crawled into some bushes there, bushes about 4 or 5 feet high and laid low. Well, all this had happened in the space of a half an hour, so it was now about 6:30 or 7 o'clock. Well, here's what happened. 300 men were hid in these little woods, and the Germans would climb up trees, and one German would spot some people hiding in some bushes over there, and would yell and point over to the people hiding in the bushes, and 3 or 4 Germans would walk down to these bushes and throw in a hand grenade, and 3 or 4 Frenchmen would come running out, and they'd just shoot them. They didn't have any arms, and it was just like shooting quail. That went on all day. About 8 o'clock in the morning, they found this little girl in the cellar and bayoneted her, and she screamed for about 5 or 10 minutes before she died. It was terrible. It was something we never forget. It was terrific. And shooting was going on and killing going on in these woods all day long. Yeah, it was the worst day of our life, no doubt about it. It couldn't be any worse. See, it would be different if we were out there fighting. If she could fight, but we were hiding. We were cornered like rats. It was different than we wanted to get out there and fight and either get killed, get it over with, or get out. I remember we reviewed. I remember personally taking out my pocketbook and going over what pictures I had and thinking my whole life through from the day I was born. Then in the afternoon, something that I remember quite clearly. In the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, everyone got to laughing hysterically. I don't know if we were laughing or crying, but we couldn't stop laughing. And at times, the Germans were walking 20 paces away from us, so it was quite dangerous to laugh like that. But we just couldn't help it. I can't remember everything that happened that day. We just stayed there all the time, and it was just terrible. I think a French captain kept us together. We wanted to get out. Most of us wanted to get out there and either get it over with or get through. And he said, no, the best thing to do would be just wait, and if they did discover us there, that we'd fight it out then. And if they didn't discover us there, well, we stood a better chance of getting out. So about 11 o'clock at night, I contacted this pilot who was just a few yards away from us. You see, it was very. The situation was terrible. We were laying maybe 3 or 4 paces from one another, and we couldn't move a bush. We couldn't move a muscle. If you fell into one position in the morning, you had to be in that same position at 11 o'clock at night. We didn't dare to move because the Germans were so close to us. They also had dogs on our trails at the beginning of the morning, and that was terrible. It was a terrible sensation to hear these dogs on our trail howling as they were, and thinking that maybe they'd come and get you. It would have been a hell of a lot. We wanted to get out and fight and get it over with, but the dogs couldn't follow us because everybody had been running in every direction, and it was impossible for them to follow our trail. Anyway, 11 o'clock at night, I went over and spoke to this American pilot and told him to stay there, and that we were going to go out in a certain direction, and if he didn't hear any firing, to come out in that same direction about an hour later. I gave him some francs. I'd had quite a few francs. I gave him francs so if he did get through, and I told him that if he ever got through, to write to my wife, and gave him my address, and then we took off. Well, everything went pretty well. Miracle after miracle happened. We passed sentries about 25 paces away, and I can remember when we had our training in school, we used to go through a lot of crazy schemes, and everybody bitched like hell. But I thank God that night that we'd had that training, because it certainly saved our lives. It progressed quite a ways until we came by a farmhouse and the dogs started barking. Someone started shooting. Someone fired at us in the general direction. And then everyone started shooting. The whole woods where we had been, all the Germans started firing. Everybody started firing. I don't know what they were firing at, but certainly they were not firing at anyone. They were just firing because everybody was so on edge. We ran across in one field and got down by a road. And it was a German sentry on this road. And we waited until he would walk down, turn around, and walk back. And as he would walk back, one of us would skip across the road. And that way we got on the other side of this road without any one of us getting killed. And once we were on the other side of the road, we then figured that we were out of the encirclement. We figured that we were in the clear. And so we felt pretty good. It was quite a relaxation after that day. And but we'd gone just a little ways when we heard a German patrol cutting us off. They'd come over 2 or 3 hedges, and they were coming across another field. We couldn't see how they possibly knew we were there, and still we figured, well, they must have seen us, because here they come. And at this point, we were through running. Even though we were in the open, we decided we won't run another inch. We'll fight it out to finish right here. I remember there was a very thick hedge, and we were waiting for them on the other side of this hedge. We couldn't see them. We could hear them running up. They ran up to the other side of the hedge, and we pulled the pins on grenades. We were going to throw the grenades over the other side of the hedge and then lay flat. After they went off, we were going to spray the bushes, spray this hedge, and then get out. Well, they came up on the other side of the hedge and stopped, and one of them said in French, "Mettez-vous en ligne," which means get in a single file, a single line. So then we knew they were Frenchmen, but we still had to be very careful, because even though they were Frenchmen, they would shoot at us if we made a noise, because they were taking no chances. The same story was repeating itself. Every group that it was getting through, those that were armed were shooting at one another, and there was a hell of a lot of confusion. So we said to them in French, "We're French, we don't know who you are, but send a man down to the gate at the other end of this hedge." See, there was a hedge and a gate down to the other end. "Send a man down there, and we'll see who you are," and so on. So they sent a man down there, and it was absolutely a miracle. The person on the other side of this hedge was the other agent, and he had the other half of our radio. Here it was, 3 miles away from the farmhouse, and we met this agent. He could have gone in any other direction of the compass. So then we were all together once more, had the radio together, and with him was this, the leader of this Mackie, Yakko. So we sent him out, sent him away, so that only 6 of us stayed together. That is, Jedburg George, 2 agents, and 1 liaison agent. And we told Yakko that we would contact him later, and in the meantime to just lay low. And so we took off by ourselves and walked about 5 miles that night, and then crawled in some bushes and went to sleep. We stayed there for 2 days. After that, we tried to contact Colonel Kingley, who was given to us by London as a chief of resistance in the Loire-Inférieure. He didn't want to see us. He was afraid. He was no good. He was afraid to do anything. He hadn't done anything for the resistance. He was a politician of the first degree, and he just never did a thing. Well, we were still quite a ways from organizing anything in the Loire-Inférieure, because everything that we had started had been shot up in the air. So we decided to go from there to Varad, which was a little town right on the river, because we had an address there in Varad, and we figured that we could make contact with some resistance group in Varad. First 24 hours in the hole wasn't too bad, but 5 days was too much. We started getting pretty grouchy and started barking at one another. So we decided to come out of the hole. Came out of the hole one afternoon and went down to the farmhouse. We hadn't shaved for 5 days, so we got a little water out of a well, started to shave. We were halfway through the process when 2 men came from the town. They came running in and said that the doctor had sent them. Said that the Gestapo knew where we were. The Gestapo and Feldgendarme knew where we were, and they were going to attack us late that afternoon. Didn't take much time. We got out of there, and this farmer took us down to his brother-in-law. We had been traveling north from the place that we had been attacked, and what we wanted to do was go into the department of the Loire-Inférieure, which was south. So we had to make a sort of a detour to the east. So we took off and went down to his brother-in-law's. And from his brother-in-law's, we marched for another 2 hours. Then it got dark. Then dawn came. We could only march for about 4 or 5 hours because the nights were very short. It was in the middle of the summer. We laid low there. Incidentally, the Gestapo did come out to the house. They killed his wife and his children. They shot the doctor, and he returned, and they killed him. And at this Chateau de Calac, where we were to begin with, where we were staying with the Count and the Countess. The next day, they shot the Count, but they didn't shoot the Countess. They had found some evidence that we had been around there and shot the Count for her. Well, this went on. We'd go from one place to another, walking about 4 or 5 hours every night. We were getting nowhere fast because we had about 150 miles to go. Every time we crossed the railroad track on our trip at night, we'd either tear up a rail or rip up what communications we came across. After we'd been walking for about 3 days, we decided to go into a town and get something to eat. We'd walk through towns every night. This going at night was all right, but we were not getting anywhere, and we were running great risks. Every night we were walking right straight through the center of towns, and Germans would be on the sidewalks, and we'd walk through the towns with a carbine on our back. Many times we were caught in the outskirts of a town by Germans, and we just never said a word and just walked right straight through, and they never said a word. While if we had made a run for it or jumped over ahead to something, they'd have said something. The bolder you were, the more you'd get away with. If you just didn't give a damn and just went on and let things take care of themselves, we seemed to get by okay. Well, when we went into this town in the daytime, in civilian clothes, we, by some miracle, met a liaison agent that we'd been working with that we had sent to the WWII, and he was coming back. So once that we were in contact with this liaison agent, we sent him ahead to the WWII to bring back a truck. So we were going to try to run this gauntlet in a truck. This was just a little while after D-Day, and all roads were being watched. It's pretty hard to circulate unless you had permission from the Germans. So he brought back a little covered truck, and this man had permission from the Germans to circulate. He was collecting milk for the Germans. It was a little covered truck, and he had 3 pigs in the back of the truck. So 5 of us get into the back of the truck with submachine guns, and we put the pigs in the corner by the driver's seat and lift up a little of the flap, exposing the pigs, and started our trip to the WWII. We were stopped 5 times by the Germans. We were stopped at every bridge we came to, and they just checked the papers, looked into the back, saw the pigs, and let us go. Well, we came into this Maquis called the Maquis of Safri. It was the Maquis, or the group of men that we had organized previously. Remember, I said we had gone down there with the Gestapo, with these 2 Gestapo agents that were working for us, and we had given orders to this leader to organize only 50 men and hold them at this farmhouse, and we were going to use these 50 men as reception committee only. We didn't want to repeat the same thing that had happened in the Mudbeyond. We didn't want to have a great collection of men and no arms, or a great collection of men at one point. Well, when we got into this Maquis, we came in about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We found about 300 men there, with arms for about 20 men, and everyone was coming and going at will, and the situation was literally screwed up. So the first thing we did was reorganize their defenses with arms for 20 men, and decided that the next morning, the very first thing we'd do would be split these men up, send them out in groups of 5, 10, 15, all throughout the country, keep them under our control, but not centralized at any one point. And then we had supper that night with the leaders of this camp, and the man who sat across from me was claimed to be one of the leaders of the underground, was a Gestapo agent. We didn't know it at the time, and he left camp that night. We still didn't know it that night that he had left camp. Well, as a result, the next thing we knew, it was 6 o'clock in the morning. We'd been sleeping in the middle of a wheat field, and this Yakko, who was chief of that little Maquis, came out, woke us up, and said, "I think we've had it." He said, we're completely surrounded. Every road is cut off, and they're moving in from every direction. And we woke up, and they were moving in. We could hear trucks coming in from every direction. It was a very uncomfortable feeling. We didn't have time to do anything. This all took place in a fraction of a second. We woke up, and the sky was filled with Very lights. The Germans had fired up Very lights in every direction. A radio operator at this time was receiving a message from London. So the first thought in our mind was let everything go and just get hold of the radio. So we ran down, picked up the radio, and the minute that these Very lights went off, hell started breaking loose. That is, they were about 200 yards away, and they just started firing machine guns at this farmhouse, and there were 300 men in and around this farmhouse, and as a result, everybody started running in opposite directions, and they were just getting nowhere fast, and men were dropping like flies. We made a desperate attempt to organize them and get them started out in 3 different groups, and we did. At this farmhouse, there was a farmer and his wife and a daughter, 8-year-old daughter. So we stuck the daughter down in the cellar, and the farmer's wife was with us. I forget to say that we found 3 Americans and 2 British pilots at this farmhouse. They'd been shot down over France, and the underground had picked them up and brought them to this Mackey. And they stuck with us. In our group, there were about 40. Just before we left, there was a Bren gun, a man who was commanding a Bren gun who'd get killed. So I picked up the Bren gun and went over to a hedge where German trucks pulled up about 15 feet away. There were 3 trucks, and we had about 3 or 4 magazines for this Bren gun. And I threw the gun up onto a hedge. Captain Arad stuck in the clips, and we fired the 3 clips into these trucks. Made the Germans yell a little bit. And we threw the gun away because we didn't have any use for the gun because we didn't have any shells for it. And then the 40 of us ran down this hedge. We ran down the hedge for about 100 yards, and then we met an FFI who came back and said it was impossible to go out that way. The Germans were coming up. He had a Sten gun and 3 clips of ammunition, so we told him to go back and fire the 3 clips of ammunition at the Germans, whether he hit them or not, as long as he fired, and then throw his gun away and then beat it and hide the best he could. Then we changed our direction and ran into point blank into a machine gun, and it got 3 or 4 of us. And so we changed our direction again and ran into another machine gun. And the 3rd machine gun we ran into, we had lost about 15 men out of our group. None of us had been killed. And the farmer's wife couldn't keep up with us, so we stuck her in a clump of bushes, and she was wearing a white dress. A white dress. And remember, it was very hard to camouflage her. After we had stuck her into these bushes and attempted to camouflage her, we could still see her a long ways away. I don't know what ever happened to her. I think that she must have been killed. There were 15 Germans in this town. Decided the odds were too great against us, so we thought we'd let them go. We went down the road about 3 miles and met a gendarme down there. We had previously sent the gendarmes out to contact the Americans and bring them back to Varad. I had given them written instructions to bring back any American that he saw. This gendarme that came down the road told us that a van had stopped in Varad. There was a German major sitting up front in the van, and the back of the van was filled with German soldiers, and that there was a Frenchman driving the van, and that the Frenchman knew that we were down there and was going to stop if we held him up. So we waited for the van. The van came down the road, and we stepped out in the road with the carbine. Colonel Felix laid on the side of the road with a grenade. The German major immediately got out and stuck his hands up in the air, so we stuck a gun in his back, told him to give an order to the Germans in the back of the van to get out of the van with their hands behind their head and leave their weapons in the van. He was quite surprised because he didn't think that we knew the soldiers in the back of the van. Well, the soldiers get out, we turn them over to the French, and the French did a job on them. And we continued down the road. And a few minutes later, we contacted the Americans, the first Americans. A gendarme had brought him back. The Americans were very skeptical at first. They thought they were running into a trap. And it took me about an hour to convince them that I was an American. Then we took the prisoners and started back for Ancenis, where I was supposed to meet Captain Arad with the plans. I got back to Ancenis, and I met Jean-Pierre, who came up to me crying. He was one of our liaison agents. First time I ever saw him crying in my life. He came up and kissed me on both cheeks, and I finally got him calmed down, and here's the story he told me. He told me that Captain Arad had came down the back road as previously planned, but he had put on his uniform for the first time in 3 months because he thought the Americans were in the area. Well, what had happened, they came down the road and heard some tanks coming up and thought they were American tanks, so waved them down, and 3 German Tiger tanks rolled up to a stop, and everybody jumped out and were going to kill him there. So he put his hands up in the air and stood there with his hands up in the air and nonchalantly gave the Germans hell for taking his weapons away, and told them that they were crazy, they didn't know what they were doing, that he was a milicien working with them, and that he'd been working with them for 4 years. And by some miracle, I don't know how it happened, there's no explanation for it, they just left him there, standing there with his hands up, walked back to the tanks, got in and drove off. And about 3 minutes later, made contact with some American tanks, and quite a battle followed. And in the battle, this liaison agent thought that Captain Arad had got killed. But before they had split up, Captain Arad had given him the plan, so the plans were in our possession. So To make a long story short, as soon as we showed the plans to Colonel Reed, who was commanding the 2nd Cavalry, he immediately took us back to 8th Corps. It took about 24 hours to get back to 8th Corps. As soon as we got back to 8th Corps, I turned the plans over to some general, I forget his name, and G2, who was Colonel Reeves, immediately photostatted the copy of the plans and sent me up the 3rd Army with the plans. I brought the plans up the 3rd Army and was taking the plans to General Patton when I met Colonel Powell, who was an SFHQ detachment attached to 3rd Army. So he took me in hand and made all the necessary arrangements to have the plans turned over. Well, we stayed there for a couple of days, and I was very much in a hurry to get back to my area, since I thought at this time that Captain Errad had been killed, and I was very much concerned about that. Well, in the 2nd day, General Patton, through Rip Powell, asked us how many men we had down there organized and not armed, and we told him 5,000. Well, he asked us if we could do a job for him, if he armed us, if we could hold his right flank if he swung towards Paris. So we told him yes. He immediately armed our men, 2,500 of our men, and I infiltrated back through the lines and found that Captain Errad was all right, the radio operator was all right, and we made the necessary arrangements to receive the arms for 2,500 men. And make a long story short, we held this flank until the 20th of August, when we received a cable through a messenger from London. It was a message sent to us by General Koenig, who wanted us to return to London for a 2nd mission. So we left Colonel Felix in charge of the troops that were holding the right flank, and we went back to London. On returning to London, we found out that our 2nd mission was to go into Paris, but it was a little too late. So on the 7th of September, we were reparachuted into the center of France on another mission, a mission called the Mission Chinoise. It was a JED mission, but we also went in with two agents. Our mission was to organize all the FFI in the departments that were already organized and those that were not organized, that we were to form them into mobile groups and attack the enemy wherever he went. Well, we hacked away at this division in the middle of France until they gave up. You remember a division gave up to the 83rd Division? Well, we were hacking away at the lower part of that division when it gave up. After they had given up, I'm just going over this very briefly, this 2nd mission, because it's similar to the 2nd one. After they had given up, we had to change directions. That is, there were no Germans in the center of France in our immediate vicinity. So we received instructions from London to turn around and come back towards the west coast, that is, towards Saint-Nazaire. At Saint-Nazaire, there were 27,000 Germans holding out, and at La Rochelle, there were about 20,000. So we organized we got them all together and moved approximately 8,000 FFI from the center of France up south of the River Loire at Saint-Nazaire. Then we combined our forces with those of the Loire and Ferrières, and we had approximately about 20,000 FFI holding in 27,000 Germans at Saint-Nazaire, and we held them from late September until the latter part of November. Many incidents happened in the meantime. I don't think I should go into detail about them, except for one. I think one is quite interesting. In the meantime, we had contacted 9th Army and were working under General Simpson. He had given us a jeep. We had contacted Major Shellcross, who was an SFHQ detachment attached to the 9th Army. We were working with very close connection with the 94th Division. Well, we had 3 machine guns mounted on this jeep, and we used to run into a town and shoot up the town if it was filled with Germans, and then get out fast, and we always got by with it. So when moving from the center of France up to Saint-Nazaire, we were more or less the advance scouts, if you want to call it that. We moved up to a little town by the name of Pornic, and inquired if there were any Germans in Portnik, and they said the Frenchmen around there said that there were very few Germans there. So we decided to go down into the town and see what there was, and if we ran into any Germans, well, we'd shoot them up and try to get out. Well, on entering the town, there's a stretch of road about 500 yards. We came down this stretch of road, and just as we were entering the town, there was a roadblock. And about 100 yards away from this roadblock, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, stepped out about 30 or 40 Germans armed with machine guns, submachine guns, and rifles. So that we were caught cold. We couldn't turn around and make a run for it because we had 500 yards to go, and they would have cut us to ribbons if we did that. And before we could stop, we were about 50 yards from them. But I stopped the Jeep, we got out of the Jeep, and stood looking at one another at 50 yards away for about 5 minutes. It was quite a situation. We just stood there looking at one another, no one doing any shooting. Finally, I came to my senses, I guess. I had a white piece of parachute around my neck, and I took it out and waved it a couple of times, and a German came out from behind the roadblock with a white handkerchief, and I met him halfway, and I didn't know what to say, so I asked him to surrender the town to us. And he said that he couldn't do that without permission from his sergeant. So he went back to get the sergeant, and the sergeant was a pretty tough bully. He came down, and I was wearing green glasses, and he jerked the glasses off my face and ordered us to come over and back of the blockade. Well, I couldn't speak German, he couldn't speak French or English, but I had a French major with me, and the major could speak English, could speak German, so he was interpreting for me, and I told this French major to tell him that I was an American officer and he'd better watch out. He immediately stood at attention, handed me back my glasses, and said he was sorry. So I asked him to surrender the town to us. And he said he didn't want to. He said he wanted to fight, and let's fight. Well, we didn't have anything to fight him with. There were 3 of us and about maybe 150 of them all together, with what was in the town. And they had the drop on us, so I asked him to see his commanding officer immediately. So he went back to call up his commanding officer. He called up his commanding officer. Commanding officer was quite a ways away and couldn't be down for, it would take about an hour before he could get down. So he asked us if we'd wait, and so we said okay. In the meantime, about 80 Germans came out, 2 and 3 at a time, and we had a carton of cigarettes, luckily, and we gave them a cigarette apiece and shook hands and patted each other on the back and talked over the war situation and tried to talk them into surrendering. 50% of them were willing to give up. We didn't have the transportation to take them out. We talked them out of it pretty easily. Some of them were Russians, some of them Polacks, and some of them thorough Germans. We gave them the argument that we were just small men in this affair and that we could easily kill one another and it wouldn't amount to anything, but the men that were actually causing this war would live afterwards and so on, and they agreed with us. One thing in particular they disliked was the English. They said if we were English, they would kill us immediately, that they had no use for the English and one thing or another. Well, anyway, in about an hour and a half, everybody stood at attention and Zeke Heil, and a lieutenant colonel came down the road. Lieutenant colonel and a lieutenant, an oblet. The obletnant spoke fluent English. He was a sort of a wormy guy, I mean, just a little insignificant, fragile-looking man. And in perfect English, he walked up and said, "My chief wants to know what you're doing here, who sent you, and what do you intend to do, and so on and so on." And I told him that a general had sent me, and we were Americans and didn't want to come down and kill them uselessly, and he wanted to know if they'd surrender to us tonight. And then the obletnant repeated it to the colonel, and the colonel said something to the obletnant. The obletnant said to my chief tells me to tell you to shut up, that he doesn't want to hear any of this talk, to go back and tell your general to come down and get him if he wants to, that we've been waiting for him for a long time, and if he thinks that he can take us, well, come and get us. Actually, no general had sent me. I wasn't from a general, but I was pulling that bluff at the time. Well, to make a long story short, we shook hands, swapped cigarettes, saluted, trembling legs walked back to the Jeep. And they didn't shoot us or take us prisoners. As we got into the Jeep, a Frenchman came up and said, "Are you Mr. Powell?" And I said, "Yes." I was going by the name of Mr. Powell around there. And he said, "I've got something to tell you, but I can't tell you right now." So we met him down around the bend, and he said, "Look, this Obletnant Schroeder," that was the Obletant's name, "he's willing to talk turkey with you, but he couldn't say anything in front of the colonel. So I made arrangements to meet this Obletant that night down on the seashore, down by La Bernerie. And he didn't show up that night, but I met him the next night. he came out in civilian clothes, and we took him back to our headquarters with his girlfriend. He was going with a French girl, and she always acted as his safe girl. That is, she always came out and checked to see that I was alone before he would come out. Well, he came out. We brought him back to our headquarters. We sat down, had a good meal, drank wine, one thing and another. After supper, he pulled out plans, gave us all complete military information of all his sector, down to the machine gun. And it checked exactly with the information that we'd got, that we had received from our agents. So he wasn't giving us false dope. Well, this went on for 2 or 3 nights, and then the Frenchman that had come in with me got scared and figured this man was a super spy playing a double game, trying to play a game with us, but actually was playing against us. Well, I couldn't quite see it, but they said if you go down and pick him up tonight and either kill him or bring him back a prisoner. So I went down, picked him up as usual, and brought him back and told him that he was my prisoner. If he tried to get away, we'd have to kill him. And they gave me a stiff argument. This is about 9 o'clock at night, and by 4 in the morning, I had convinced the Frenchman that we should give him a chance anyway and try him, because he couldn't really do us any harm. He didn't know too much about us. He'd come back to our headquarters and knew where it was, but I'm sure that he knew where it was before, because some French were playing a double game. That is, they'd spy for us and spy for the other side. You had to be careful who you were using for agents. So about 4 o'clock in the morning, after arguing from 9 to 4, they decided to let him, to play ball with him. So we were going to give him a chance to prove himself. So we took him into this room and said, okay, Schroeder, we're going to let you go. He was very happy. And said, here's what we're going to give you to prove yourself. Tomorrow, you send 10 Germans out from Pornic, where you're staying, to La Bernerie, and from La Bernerie to Arcton. And while they're on that road, we'll ambush them somewhere. And so 3 o'clock next afternoon, just like murder, 10 Germans walking down the middle of the road in a column of 2, so we knocked off 4 of them the first shot, and the others gave up. So then we took these prisoners up to General Maloney, who was commanding 94th Division in Mount. In the meantime, his commanding officer had forced him to send out a patrol of 60 men to look for the 10 men who had disappeared in thin air, and we didn't have time to lay an ambush. And result, we didn't get all of them. They killed about 5 of us, and we killed about 20 of them, and got a couple of, wounded a few, and some of them got away. Make a long story short, this guy played with us all the time. One Saturday night, about 6 o'clock, I received a letter from him, in which he stated that 6 o'clock the next morning he was going to attack on a depth of 10 miles, but on a frontage of 20 miles, and occupy the following points, and that he himself wasn't actually going to lead the attack, and he wanted us to set ambushes in certain places and so on and so on. And at 6 o'clock the next morning he came out, the Germans came out exactly as he said they would on the very roads, and we ambushed them and killed a lot of them, and they killed a few of us, but they came out in a very strong force, and they did occupy the points that they were, they occupied their objectives. Well, here's the reason why this lieutenant was playing this way. His father was a German, and his mother was a South American. I think she came from Chile. He had lived in South America most of his life, and had been in the Merchant Marines for a long time. And when war broke out, he was in Germany, and he was forced into the Navy and given a commission. And his boat had been sunk, and so all these Navy men were on land acting as ground troops. And what he wanted to do was to get a clear passport back to South America with no strings attached, which I promised him if he'd play ball with us, and that's how we played ball with him. Now, I left the area of Saint-Nazaire about 2 weeks ago, and we had a telephone line running from his side of the line to our side of the line, so that when he intended to do something, launch an attack, he just called us up and told us about it. Sounds quite fantastic. Nevertheless, it's true. We had, well, that takes care of his little story. As far as I know, he's still working. One time, we had taken some of their prisoners, and we swapped them for our prisoners. And when the German prisoners were turned back in exchange for French prisoners, they said that Oberleutnant Schreider had been working with us. Some FFI had shot his mouth off to the prisoners, bragging that one of them was working with us. So it put a lot of pressure on him. The colonel started watching him. So then some of our men were some FFIs were captured, and they told the general on the other side that the lieutenant colonel was playing with us, so the general started watching the lieutenant colonel and took the pressure off from the old Lieutenant Schreider so he could work with us again. Well, at this time we had about 20,000 FFI holding in these Germans at Saint-Nazaire. And General de Latminer, who was General de Gaulle's second in command, took charge of all the western coast, that is, of Saint-Nazaire and of La Rochelle. And Schaeff, through his request, Schaeff pulled us in from the field, and he made a large request to Schaeff for arms to arm all these Frenchmen, and as far as I know at this moment, they're either holding or planning an attack against Saint-Nazaire or La Rochelle. Then I returned to Paris, and from Paris to London, where I made a report, and that's all.